Hello, and welcome to my third video of the climate series of videos that I have produced over the last couple of years and posted on YouTube for informational and educational purposes. If you have not watched the first two videos, I encourage you to see them. Links to the first two videos are listed in the credits following this video. This video is a focus on the controversial subject of converting the entire United States energy system into a zero-emission, renewable fuels-only system. Putting aside the flawed reason for making such a disruptive and unbelievably costly change to a perfectly good existing energy system, this video will explain the feasibility and technical challenges that are seemingly ignored by those bent on implementing such far-reaching impositions on citizens of the United States. To set the tone for discussing the costs of a renewable energy economy in the United States, I will give you an overview of financial history of the country. Enjoy the video. To begin the financial review, let me explain the term GDP, because I will be referring to the term frequently. Gross domestic product is the market value of all goods and services produced in a nation, in this case the United States, during a period of time, usually 1 year. GDP is tracked and calculated by United States Government Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the Department of Commerce. The agency tracks the quantity of each good and service produced in a year by their estimated price to get the dollar value, and then adding all the dollar values to get the total GDP. This graph illustrates all of the components that make up the GDP. It is a very useful and interesting way to track the economy from year to year and determine how each sector is performing. Results from the GDP are commonly used by segments of the service and manufacturing industries as a yardstick for measuring productivity and progress. This diagram depicts how the flow of money, capital goods, and services circulates throughout the economy. The three horizontal blocks show markets for goods and services, factor markets, and financial markets, and the four blocks in the vertical is government, households, firms, and then the rest of the world. And this shows how goods and money is circulated throughout all these markets to keep trade functioning around the world. Interestingly, every economy in countries of the world is driven by a different ideology. An example of this is a planned economy versus a market economy, as shown here. A planned economy is the economy in which course of economic activities is decided by some central authority or by the government. A market economy, it is that economy in which economic activities are fully dependent on the role of market forces. The United States has always been a market economy, although recently they are being taken over by the government and beginning to lean as a socialistic country rather than in its own self-interest. This chart shows the debt to GDP ratio of the United States. The U.S. GDP always exceeded debt except during World War II years and following the 2008 recession. In August of 1971, President Nixon severed the tie between the U.S. dollar and gold. Since then, nearly every administration has used debt for social programs and other activities, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2008, the U.S. debt exceeded GDP for the first time since World War II, and the deficit continues to climb today. This chart shows more detail for the components that make up the U.S. GDP and how they fared between 1947 and 2017. Interestingly, manufacturing has declined significantly over those years, while most other aspects of the economy has grown. This is due in large part to the trade practices of the United States. This chart shows U.S. debt to GDP from 1977 to 2012 and how the federal debt has grown and other sectors have improved their ratios. Financial debt, business debt, and household debt have all been reduced while government debt continues to climb. Here is one of the most interesting and informative charts you will ever see. It shows the Dow Jones Industrial Average from 1896 through the year 2016. So much information is crammed onto this chart that it would take hours to discuss, and even then, much would be overlooked. Here are some interesting features worthy of pointing out. First, the recovery time between major crashes is an interesting phenomenon. It is difficult to analyze why markets took so long to recover while so much economic activity and new infrastructure was improving life conditions in the United States. Money supply likely had much to do with that, but it also was affected by human events that are so well explained on the chart. There are 121 events shown on this chart, many of them creating rise and fall of the stock market. Secondly, monetary policy and government intervention has created the false hypothesis that the market will not have a disastrous crash in our modern times because there is no incentive to restrict monetary flow, so more debt is the answer. Thirdly, many of the events noted on the chart relate to presidential and political policies, but it is clear that these are important and lasting policies. Laws are rarely repealed, and computers are now filled with laws we have long forgotten. Fourthly, one of the things that stand out on the chart is the tremendous advance in value of the Dow Jones Industrial Average since 1930. One needs only to look around to see the tremendous improvement in the life of Americans brought forth by the industrial revolutions. My contention is that a great part of this was due to advances in the energy infrastructure that enabled this progress to be possible. Here is a different version of the chart showing the Dow Jones Industrial Average history by points. The Dow Jones did not even reach 5,000 points until 1997, and then since then it has gone up over 35,000 points. You can see the big blip caused by the COVID around 2020 and the remarkable financial recovery that was almost entirely caused by federal monetary policies. This graph shows shares of GDP for net exports of goods and services. It is abundantly clear that the U.S. now exports few goods and services. Alternatively, the U.S. is burdened with importing a huge portion of goods and services with a negative effect on the GDP or cash flow of the nation. This shows the effect of the misguided policies of importing goods and services. Progress in the U.S. has been reduced for many years, and the country is suffering dire homeless and lack of jobs for its citizens. The country has not been at 3% GDP for over 10 years. This graph gives you an idea what is happening today. Nearly every category of the items that make up the U.S. GDP have gone downhill since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the U.S., except for government and financial services. This map of the United States shows the trends of each state with percent change in real GDP for only one quarter in the year 2019. Only 3 states have GDP growth exceeding 3%: Texas, Utah, and Washington. Now that we have a financial history and current events fresh in mind, I will now turn to the United States energy picture. As I have said in every past video, energy is the key to progress and prosperity in our country. The financial progress is nearly always parallel with the energy progress and stability. First, some energy history. In early times, wood was the dominant source of energy for everything. Therefore, from early times until the mid-1800s, mankind made little progress in living conditions, especially for the majority of humans. Then fossil fuels were discovered and things began to change. Coal, natural gas, petroleum, and later nuclear energy fueled the discoveries that modernized the world. While it took over 250 years, the results were steady and spectacular. Get your mind around the facts depicted in this graph. Since 1970, the U.S. GDP has increased a staggering 262%, while the aggregate emissions from fossil fuels have gone down 73%. Those two statistics prove without doubt that fossil fuels are indispensable in the well-being of our country. Energy consumption increased 44%, while the population increased 59%, all while transportation increased 189%. We will never likely see that kind of improvement in the United States the way things are heading now. This slide begins to show the story of the real world with respect to energy in the United States. Renewable energy will not be capable of ever replacing fossil fuels for reasons you will begin to understand as this video progresses from this point onward. I want to focus for a moment on this very deceiving renewable energy slide. It leads one to believe that tremendous progress has been made with renewable sources. Several claims are just not true. First, industry uses next to zero wood for energy. Secondly, biofuels have little or no chance of being produced in quantities that are meaningful. Third, wind and solar will never be able to satisfy all energy needs because of their intermittent availability. More later about this. This graphic, produced by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, showing sources and uses of energy in the United States in 2016, is a good picture of energy disposition. First and foremost, I would like to comment on one extremely important aspect of this slide. Everything on this graphic represents infrastructure that is bought, paid for, is operational, and forms the basis of the United States energy system. Every aspect of residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation modes throughout the United States is built around these energy sources. Modification to any one source triggers a spiraling effect on infrastructure, not to mention the disruptions. To change the entire concept of energy generation in the United States is paramount to starting over and retooling everything that was built over a 250-year time period. Each one of the blocks on the left of this graphic represents trillions of dollars in infrastructure and technology that has been proven and optimized to the utmost. To even think this could be replaced with any chance of reaching the same level of stability and flexibility is wishful thinking. Imagine the disruption to all aspects of the economy. The United States has long been a model for economic development in the world. Because of capitalism, our prices of energy have always been based upon supply and demand. This has created the competition between energy resources that we now have and kept energy available for everyone. In just a few years since the socialistic factions have come forward with their desire to eliminate fossil fuels, our lowest cost coal fuels have been threatened and reduced in use. Overall, energy prices have increased as a result, driving manufacturing out of the United States. Now they want to do this to the other energy sources like gas and fuel oil. This chart shows U.S. energy consumption by energy source in 2018. Things today in 2022 have not changed much. Petroleum provides 36% of our energy, natural gas 31%, coal 13%, nuclear electric power is 8%, and all of the renewables make up 11%. This chart shows energy consumption by sector in 2021. Residential 16.5%, 11.63 quads, commercial 8.67 quads, 12.4% of consumption, transportation 24.25 quads, or 34.8% of consumption, and industrial is 25.24 quads, making up 34.3% of consumption. So let's take a look at what they want to do with the energy in the United States. This slide shows the renewable energy goal for the United States. As it articulates, all fossil fuels are to be eliminated. The goal does not come with an explanation of how this is to be achieved. Also, there is no mention that nearly all energy infrastructure in the United States must be uprooted to make way for this renewable energy. Quadrillions of dollars would be involved in this misbegotten venture. So the renewable energy plan is to transition from this previously explained chart showing all of the energy sources in the United States to this all renewable slide in just 28 years. Before I begin to review the chart and the absurdities of the plan, think about just a snippet of what is involved. 1. Replace 276 million motor vehicles to battery-charged electric vehicles. 2. Convert 132 million homes in the U.S. to all electric. No gas, so replace water heaters, stoves, etc. 3. Shut down and demolish 23,417 electric generators at 11,070 electric generating plants in the United States, and many more that are not utility scale size. 4. Convert 5,900,000 commercial buildings to all electric. 5. Shut down and replace or modify all industrial processes that currently are fueled with fossil fuels. 6. Shut down and replace fossil fuel central heating and cooling plants at nearly every one of the 3,982 universities and colleges in the United States. Likewise, for nearly every government complex in the United States. 7. Shut down and demolish 150,000 gasoline fueling stations for gas-fueled automobiles. This is but a few of the disruptions and expenses that this renewable energy idealism would create if it is not stopped. Now for a review of the hardcore wind and solar issues. Previous slides showed the data for energy use in the United States. Overall, the energy use is 102 quadrillion BTUs per year. Yes, that is 102 with 15 zeros. To generate all energy in the U.S. with electricity would require 3,412,471 megawatts of electricity generation per hour. At the present time, the United States generates 1,254,637 megawatts of electricity per hour, nearly all with fossil fuel. So now, the greenies wish to do this all with renewable solar and wind energy. So take a look at the 5 blocks on the left side of this diagram. Solar would generate 60%, or 1,920,000 megawatts. Wind would generate 40%, or 1,265,000 megawatts. Hydro would generate 83,000 megawatts. Geothermal would generate 7,700 megawatts, and biomass would generate 135,430 megawatts. All of the wind and solar would be transformed from low voltage to high voltage for distribution, where reduced to the user voltages. All of this results in nearly 8% losses. Since wind and solar is not available except when the wind blows and the sun shines, some form of substitution is necessary during these times. Most of this is handled now with fossil fuel power generation. This negates the main purpose of relying on wind and solar to achieve these so-called zero emissions. So for a solution to this dilemma, battery backup has been proposed. However, batteries of the size and capabilities needed have not been advanced in technology far enough to achieve this. The largest battery to date that has been tested and is now in use forms a 300 megawatt storage capability with a 4 hours of storage capability. While this is woefully inadequate, wind and solar plants are spending billions of dollars to develop and install these batteries. The same is true so far for the electric vehicle industry, which is facing short driving distances between charges and a huge lack of stations for charging the batteries. In order to evaluate the impact of converting to a wind and solar energy systems throughout the United States, I have calculated and determined the number of solar farms and wind farms necessary to meet the requirements to achieve this goal. First, let's focus on solar, the large block on the upper left of the diagram. Based upon present technology with photovoltaic panels and a solar farm generating 550 megawatts, that would require 9 million solar panels and 10 square miles of land. To meet the 56.7 quad solar output, 3,490 solar plants, each rated 550 megawatts, would be spread around the United States. A total of 310.4 billion solar panels are required on 34,490 square miles of land. Total cost would be $86.23 trillion, not including transmission costs and costs to convert homes, factories, new electric autos, etc., etc. Now, looking at the wind, the large block on the left side in the middle of the page, based upon present technology with wind turbines and wind farms generating 300 megawatts that has 86 wind turbines on 25 square miles of land. To meet the 37.8 quad wind output, 4,216 wind farms would be spread around the U.S. A total of 362,587 wind turbines would be required and 105,403 square miles of land would be needed. Total cost, $1.9 trillion, not including the transmission and other costs mentioned above. It has been proposed to use battery backup for both solar and wind plants. The battery backup systems available now are 300 megawatt with 1,200 kilowatt hours of storage, which gives 4 hours of storage, a ridiculously low amount. 3,490 solar battery plants would cost $1.5 trillion. Likewise, for wind, 4,216 battery plants would be $1.92 trillion. To summarize all of this, it would cost well over $100 trillion. And that does not begin to cover the total cost of the automotive and other items mentioned before. It is likely that total cost impact could exceed over $500 trillion. These next 4 pages are calculations that were prepared for the purpose of confirming the amount of energy required to supply the entire United States energy needs utilizing only renewable energy sources. At the present time, this energy is supplied mostly by fossil fuels with some other renewable sources. The concept will be to convert the entire energy system to electricity generated from renewables: wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and biomass. Now I'll get into the brick and mortar part of wind and solar. First is wind. This slide shows what has been happening with wind energy around the U.S. up to the year 2018. Although a tremendous amount of money has been spent and even more bragging has happened, progress has been slow and technology improvements have been even slower. Texas leads the U.S. in wind plants on the ground. Here is a simplified example of a single wind turbine installation. Keep in mind that sometimes hundreds of these individual turbines are grouped into a single wind farm. This United States average wind speed chart shows some very important facts. The wind speed chart ranges from 4 meters per second, which is 8.9 miles per hour, to 10 meters per second, which is 22 miles per hour wind speeds across the U.S. Many of the areas are hardly worth the money, and others are so populated that large tracts of land are scarce. One thing is clear when thinking about this chart. Average wind speeds are not constant and are variable depending on location. Here is the bottom line. Expecting to get a constant nameplate output from wind farms is an absolute impossibility. So when you hear a greenie say we are constructing a lot of 300 megawatt wind farms, the actual realized output is significantly less compared with a fossil fuel plant that must guarantee 24-hour rated output. Wind farms use huge amounts of real estate, as you can see here. The amount of output per acre of land is ridiculous and not acceptable on either land or sea. Just think about land values, and you wonder why anyone would bankroll this expensive energy option. But bankroll they do, as illustrated on this map of existing wind projects in the U.S. larger than 1 megawatt. The state of Texas recently found out the hard way how unreliable wind farms can be when you need them most, especially when they constitute the sole source of energy and there is not adequate backup. This graph illustrates another factor about wind turbines that is not favorable to constant output. As the wind speed fluctuates, as it constantly does, so does the windmill rotor speed, resulting in constant output fluctuations. This graph shows yet another issue with wind turbines. A wind turbine has a cut-in speed at approximately 3 meters per second, which is 6 miles per hour. Below that wind speed, no energy is generated. Likewise, wind speed above 14 meters a second, or 30 miles per hour, requires the turbine be shut down. Wind gusts above this speed is very common. This chart shows actual output of an operational turbine over an 8,000-hour time period. Imagine if you wanted to use this as your only power source over those 8,000 hours. There are significant periods of time that you could not run your refrigerator. This is also a huge issue with the power grid because they have to deal with this unreliable and intermittent source. Somehow, the greenies have managed to manipulate the power regulators into mandating renewable energy by prioritized grid operations, so it must be purchased first over more reliable providers. This political mandate has caused numerous blackouts in the state of California. The latest trend by the renewables crowd is the push to install wind in large offshore farms, as shown here. This graphic depicts a proposed offshore wind farm 220 kilometers, 136 miles from land. These types of wind farms are also subject to the same limitations as onshore wind farms described before. The wind must blow within the parameters shown on previous charts. Watching these kinds of proposals reminds me that wind machines are purely political power sources and wasteful of the United States energy dollars. At least these ugly beasts are far out of sight in the ocean. Now, let's take a look at the utility-scale solar power in the United States. This photovoltaic resource map of the United States shows the amount of solar radiance available across the U.S. on an annual averaged basis. The dark areas provide up to 6.5 kilowatt hours per square meters per day when the sun is shining and at peak hours of the daytime. Of course, none at night. However, in nearly half of the United States, the amount available drops to 4.5 to 5.0 kilowatt hours per meter per day. In other words, that part of the country may generate about half the amount as the dark areas on the map. What this means is nearly double the amount of real estate is required to generate the same amount of energy in those sections of the country. This is a very significant factor with renewable energy, both wind and solar. This graph shows energy density of various fossil fuels and a couple of batteries that are being used in the energy industries. Energy density is the amount of energy that can be stored in a given system or substance or region of space. Energy density is measured in energy per volume or per mass. The graph shows the amount of energy in BTU per cubic feet of some of the liquid fuels, such as diesel and gasoline. These liquid fuel density values show in clear terms why wind and solar will never compete with fossil fuels. This table shows how natural gas and coal compare to wind, solar, and wood on a density basis. In the real world, coal, natural gas, and other fuels require very, very small amounts of real estate to provide huge amounts of electricity, while wind and solar need miles and miles of space to even come close. That is the wind and solar density problem. This chart shows another of a solar plant's major drawbacks. For a 550 megawatt solar power plant, it generates electrical output for a very small amount of hours each year, and then only good output on an average summer day. Even then, it is subject to the whims of weather. Fossil fuels operate 24-hour, 7-day, 365 days a year at peak output if necessary. Meanwhile, power generated from solar plants is extremely dependent on time of day, weather, and season to produce any output at all. This is another chart that illustrates what I am talking about. Considering a base design solar plant with a nameplate capacity of 550 megawatt, the net output on an average summer day is nearly 150 megawatts output less. Therefore, you need to install many more solar panels than are used to achieve anything close to a decent long-term output. This means using lots more real estate. This graph shows how a utility views solar power plants. It is clear from the chart that the energy from solar power is only available a very limited period over 24 hours of the day. Even during the times when solar power is said to be available, a cloud may upset the amount of power availability. This picture was taken in the state of Colorado shortly after a snow event that crippled an entire solar farm. Fortunately, the fossil fuel plant in the background was able to save the day. Unfortunately, the fossil fuel plant will be shut down soon because of the renewable energy mandates. The reliability doesn't matter. The millions of solar panels do not come close to matching yearly output from the existing fossil fuel plant, and it is available come rain, snow, clouds, nightfall, and even tornadoes. You recall this map from before showing that the eastern half of the United States is capable of solar generation at 1/2 the rates as the western half. Therefore, the same 550 megawatt solar plant used in the west only generates 225 megawatts when used in the east. So twice the amount of real estate is required to produce the same 550 megawatt output. This chart shows the difference in real estate required for fossil power plants in the blue square and solar and wind power plants in the red square to satisfy the energy needs of the entire United States. The red square energy is only available when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. The blue square is available 24-hour, 365 days per year. The red square shows the bulk real estate as though all of the plants are adjacent to each other. Of course, that is impossible because the sites would be spread all over the U.S. and must be located where power is needed and where large amounts of real estate is available. Naturally, where power is needed the most, land for solar and wind is not available. Large cities like that shown here need dependable 24-hour energy to remain viable. If the United States resorts to land use as shown here for solar plants, much of the U.S. wilderness will become contaminated with inefficient and unsightly solar panels. This is an actual location photograph taken in China. This illustrates what will become of the U.S. landscape over time. Then everyone will wake up and say, "What have we done?" To transition to all wind and solar will require more solar plants than people that now occupy the landscape. In fact, more than 31 billion panels will be spread throughout the country. How stupid is that? Now let's take a look at utility scale battery backup for wind and solar in the United States. I know you have heard about the solution for wind and solar industries, battery backup. In fact, headlines have declared problem solved, lithium-ion batteries to the rescue. Of course, technology to make these batteries practical for utility-scale use is far away and not yet proven. First of all, the batteries required to back up a utility-sized solar or wind farm would need to be very large in capacity, because solar and wind could be unavailable for days or even weeks because of uncooperative weather. Also, batteries are incredibly expensive and short-lived. This photo shows a utility-size battery backup for a large solar plant. Battery systems used in the wind and solar industry range in size up to 300 megawatt capacity with a storage capability of 1200 megawatts. This will deliver 4 hours of storage time. Imagine how large the battery requirement would get for a plant that needed days or weeks of storage. They would cost more than the plant costs, and they would be backing up a very small amount of time. As this photo shows, battery storage requires cooling systems to maintain temperatures within the enclosure and to prevent battery fires. Here's a view of a battery system on a wind farm in Australia. Battery backup for wind is kind of a joke because the battery system is really installed primarily to smooth out the up and down problem with wind because it never blows at the same velocities. As I said, using battery systems on a wind farm is more about leveling power output than it is about providing backup electricity when the wind is not blowing. This chart shows the electricity costs across the United States in 2018. The red states on the chart all have very high electricity costs, and these happen to be those states that have implemented zero emissions mandates on power generation. Most of these states must now import electricity from nearby states to keep their power grid operational. In effect, that imported power is fossil fuel generated in most cases. This map shows the location of the wholesale electricity pricing hubs throughout the United States. Each one covers a section of the U.S. that is interconnected by way of their electrical grid that serves to distribute the electricity. This gives the electricity providers within a region the ability to buy and sell electricity to cover shortages or outages of power. Let me be clear that nearly every state independently cares for their power requirements. Only when there are shortages or pricing advantages do states import or export power. But you may have noticed that each state has a different electricity cost. This is nearly always dependent on the type of electricity generated within that state. Fossil fuel energy has a long history of lower prices and more reliability. Those states that are converting to wind and solar have been required to charge exorbitant prices. The politicians in the United States are bent on elimination of fossil fuels and dictating the conversion to wind and solar. Over the last 40 years, progress has been slow because people are beginning to realize this is nothing more than an attempt to take over the power industry. Sounds like what happened to healthcare in the United States, doesn't it? This is a photo of Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant in the state of California. This plant will be shut down in 2024 and 2025 and be replaced with renewable energy. Diablo Canyon Nuclear Plant produces 2,440 megawatts of electricity on a 900-acre plot of land. Replacing this amount of electricity will require 40 square miles of solar panels, and these solar panels will produce electricity for only 10 hours each day. This Google map shows very well how much land will be needed to replace the nuclear plant with wind and solar energy. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. plans to convert to all renewable energy by 2050, which is 28 years from now. This is audacious and unachievable. Take a look at this slide and do the math. The U.S. would need to build 6,864 wind and solar farms. That's 1,144 plants every 6 years. Putting aside the tremendous amount of time it would take to exercise eminent domain to take over that amount of real estate for these mammoth plants, and the environmental impact reports that would be necessary before that could even begin, it still takes 6 more years to develop and implement each project. This graph illustrates the absurdity of what is happening. According to the graph, the U.S. is planning, not building, 32 gigawatts of solar and wind generating capacity for the year 2020. The U.S. will need 3,412 gigawatts be converted to wind and solar by 2050, or 28 years from now. But at the rate shown in the graph, it will take 3,412 divided by 32, or 106 years to accomplish the mandated goal. That's the stupidity of it all. So now let me jump into the financial possibilities that could happen with all of this. This graph shows the federal debt held by the public up to the year 2020 and a projection up to 2030. I am quite sure the bump after 2020 is due to COVID-19 virus pandemic and has nothing to do with the energy boondoggle that is going on. But as you can see, debt will skyrocket to 110% of GDP, even without considering the energy boondoggle. Take a look at this disturbing chart showing the negative effect of an all-electric economy in the United States. This chart shows debt held by the public as a percent of GDP. And you can see that it predicts by 2050, the United States debt will skyrocket to over 220% of GDP. So we will owe incredible amounts of debt as a result of converting the United States to an all-electric economy. This chart shows some of the financial implications around the globe. The upper chart shows gains and losses in 2035 of national GDPs for various countries. The United States is not looking very well. It is far below the cumulative GDP losses of any other country on earth. But China, on the other hand, and some of the other countries are improving dramatically because they have chosen to remain on fossil fuel energies. I'm ending this video with this very disturbing graphic. While it is only conjecture, all things could go this way without some adjustments in the way our energy system is being controlled. Instead of energy utopia in 2050, the U.S. will be a bankrupted, failing country with debts far exceeding GDP by over $50 trillion. The average American will be transformed back to the Dark Ages. If you look at the year 2020 on the chart, consumer debt is $14.6 trillion. And by 2050, when the country is 100% renewable, our consumer debt will have increased to $100 trillion, and we will still not have a reliable source of energy. Thank you for watching, and please join me in the long fight to preserve our fossil fuels and freedom of energy choice. Thank you.